I carried the queen through the flames. She rose and called me her husband. The last city on earth was burning. Flames rose high into the dark sky, licking at the stars as if trying to claim them. The distant sounds of war echoed in the night, a relentless hum of gunfire, explosions, and the screams of people caught in the chaos. The war had dragged on for years, and now it seemed there was no end in sight. The Earth had become a battlefield for the Zelithar, an alien empire that had invaded humanity's home with an iron fist. Among the wreckage of a once beautiful city, Elias Thorn fought on. He wasn't a soldier by choice, not really. A mechanic before the war, Elias had joined the resistance when his peaceful life was shattered by the alien attack. The Zelithar had come without warning, sweeping through the human defenses like a tide, crushing everything in their path. Only small pockets of resistance remained, scattered across the globe, fighting against overwhelming odds. But Elias wasn't one for grand speeches or heroic acts. He fought because he had no other choice. His people needed him, and he couldn't stand idly by. The city was on its last legs. Buildings that once scraped the sky now lay in ruins, their skeletons charred and crumbling. The ground was cracked, and rivers of molten debris flowed in the streets. The fight had reached its climax. There was no retreat, no safe place to run. The Zelithar were everywhere. Yet amidst all this destruction, Elias had a single task to complete. He had to save her. Seraphina, the queen of humanity's last stronghold, had been caught in the thick of the battle. Despite her position, despite the army of loyal soldiers that should have protected her, she had chosen to fight beside them. She was not a queen who hid in the safety of a palace. She led from the front, fighting as fiercely as any of her people. But now, after an attack from the Zelithar forces, she lay motionless on the battlefield, her life slipping away with every passing second. Elias pushed through the chaos, his heart pounding in his chest. He didn't know how he ended up in this position. How had he become the one responsible for carrying the Queen of Humanity through the flames? It didn't matter. He couldn't leave her there, not like this. The soldiers around him were retreating, running in every direction to escape the inevitable. But Elias wasn't like them. He had been through too much to give up now. He had to get Seraphina out of here. She had been injured badly. Her arm hung limp at her side, and there was blood everywhere, so much blood. Elias gritted his teeth and picked her up, his arms wrapping around her as gently as he could. She was heavier than he expected, and for a moment he stumbled under the weight. But he didn't let go. He couldn't. The Queen of Humanity was depending on him. "Hold on," he whispered, although he knew she couldn't hear him. Her eyes fluttered open briefly, meeting his gaze, but there was no recognition in them. She was slipping in and out of consciousness. He looked around, scanning the chaos for a way out. There was nothing. No safe route. The enemy was closing in. But there was one place left, one option that could save them both. He turned towards the old underground tunnels, a secret escape route used by the resistance. It was the only chance they had. The world seemed to close in on him as he made his way through the ruins, the smoke and heat suffocating. The Zelithar were relentless. They were everywhere, searching for any sign of life. Elias had to keep moving. He had to keep Seraphina alive. The tunnel entrance was only a few hundred meters away, but every step felt like an eternity. His muscles burned and his legs threatened to give out from under him, but he kept going. He couldn't stop now, not when he was this close. He had made a promise to himself, and to her, that he would get her to safety, no matter the cost. As they neared the entrance, a loud explosion rocked the ground beneath them. The force of it threw Elias off balance, and he fell to his knees, barely managing to protect Seraphina from the brunt of the impact. Dirt and rubble rained down around them, and the world seemed to spin. But Elias didn't stop. He crawled forward, dragging himself and Seraphina along the ground, his hands scraping against the rough earth. Finally, he reached the entrance to the tunnel. The door was a heavy metal slab, old and rusted from years of disuse. He had to force it open, but his hands were shaking too badly to get a good grip. Sweat dripped from his brow, and his breath came in ragged gasps. The tunnel was their only hope, and if he failed to open that door, they would both be trapped. With a grunt, Elias finally wrenched the door open. It creaked loudly, and the dark passage beyond beckoned them forward. Without thinking, he pulled Seraphina into the tunnel, dragging her along the narrow passage as quickly as he could. It felt like hours before they finally reached the hidden resistance base. When Elias collapsed onto the cold floor, his body aching from the strain, he barely had the strength to move. His fingers fumbled as he pulled Serafina into a room, laying her on a cot. The room was quiet, dark except for the faint glow of emergency lights. Elias watched as Serafina's chest rose and fell with shallow breaths. He had done it. He had saved her. But he knew the fight wasn't over. The Zelithar wouldn't stop until they had destroyed humanity. He had to get back out there. He had to keep fighting. For Serafina, for the people of Earth. Her breathing slowed, and for a moment, Elias thought she might slip away from him. But then her eyes fluttered open again. She looked up at him, her gaze weak but still filled with a strength that defied everything they had been through. "You saved me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I knew you would." Elias didn't know how to respond. What could he say? He had just carried her through a battlefield, through fire and death. But in that moment, he realized something. This wasn't just about survival. It wasn't just about the fight. It was about the people they were fighting for. The hope that humanity would rise again, no matter the cost. Serafina's fingers moved weakly, brushing against Elias' arm. "You are not just a soldier," she murmured, her voice soft but filled with a certainty that sent a chill down his spine. "You are the one who will help us rebuild." Elias looked at her, and for the first time he saw her not as a queen, but as a person, someone who had been through the same pain, the same loss, the same struggle as he had. And in that moment, something shifted between them. It wasn't just about saving her anymore. It was about saving them all. As Elias sat by her side, watching her slowly drift back to sleep, he felt the weight of the world on his shoulders. The war was far from over, but for the first time he felt a flicker of hope. And with that hope, he promised himself one thing. He would stand by Serafina, not as a soldier, but as something more. The days that followed their escape were a blur of motion, pain, and quiet moments of recovery. Elias didn't rest. Even when he felt the overwhelming weight of exhaustion pulling at him, he pushed it aside. The survival of Serafina, and with her, humanity's last hope, depended on his every decision. He couldn't afford to let fatigue slow him down. The underground base they had stumbled upon was a hidden sanctuary, known only to the most trusted members of the resistance. Its walls were thick, the air damp with the scent of stone and earth. The base had once been a secret military facility, constructed long before the Zelithar invasion. Now, it served as a refuge for a handful of survivors, soldiers, doctors, engineers, and civilians who had nowhere else to go. Elias had barely noticed the others as he carried Serafina to a small medical bay. His focus had been solely on her. The medical staff worked tirelessly to stabilize Serafina. Her wounds were deep, but they weren't beyond healing. They had lost many in the battle, but Serafina's life was their last chance at a future. They needed her, her leadership, her strength. The whispers of her survival spread like wildfire throughout the base. People were beginning to believe again. For the first time in years, hope stirred in their hearts. Serafina remained unconscious for days. Elias would visit her room every few hours, checking on her, sitting silently by her side. He hadn't known how much he cared for her until now. She was more than just a queen. She was a symbol of everything they were fighting for, a future, a chance to rebuild, to make the world whole again. He had heard rumors of the power she held, of an ancient legacy passed down through generations of her family. But Elias didn't care for legends or myths. He cared about the woman lying in front of him, the woman who had put herself at the front of every battle, the woman who had inspired thousands of people to fight back against the invaders. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a soft golden light through the small window in Serafina's room, she stirred. Elias had been sitting by her side, his eyes heavy with sleep. The moment she moved, he snapped awake. His heart quickened in his chest, and he leaned forward. "Serafina," he whispered, his voice barely audible. Her eyelids fluttered open, her pale eyes focusing slowly on him. There was a faint trace of confusion in her gaze, but it quickly shifted to recognition. "Elias," she murmured, her voice hoarse. You saved me." He didn't know how to respond. The words seemed so inadequate compared to what they had been through. Instead, he nodded and gently brushed a strand of hair away from her face. "I promised I would," he said quietly. Her lips parted in a small, weak smile. "You did more than that. You carried me through fire, Elias." He glanced away, trying to hide the blush creeping up his neck. He wasn't used to receiving such praise, especially not from someone like her. She was royalty, a queen. He was just a soldier, a mechanic before the war, but none of that mattered now. They were both survivors, both fighting for the same thing. I couldn't leave you there, he said, his voice steady. We have to keep going, the fight isn't over. Serafina's gaze hardened. No, it's not, but we need to plan, we need to think about what comes next. Elias nodded. The Zelithar won't stop until they wipe us out completely. We need to regroup, build an army, and take the fight to them. Serafina's eyes darkened. We've been fighting for so long, but we can't do it alone. We need more than soldiers, we need a purpose. Her words struck him deep. He had always thought of this war as a battle to survive, but now he realized it was more than that. It was about something much greater. It was about rebuilding. It was about reclaiming what had been taken from them, humanity's future. Over the next few days, Serafina grew stronger. Her mind was sharp and her presence commanded attention. Elias spent every moment by her side, learning from her, listening to her ideas. Despite her injury, she never once showed weakness. Instead, she exuded strength, determination, and an unwavering belief in the cause. The resistance had been fragmented for so long. There were small pockets of fighters scattered across the world, but they lacked coordination, a unified goal. Serafina's first order of business was to change that. She sent out messengers to every surviving faction, calling for a meeting to unite under a single banner. It was a risky move, one that could either strengthen their cause or destroy them entirely. As the days passed, Elias watched Serafina lead with an authority he had never seen before. She wasn't just giving orders, she was inspiring. Her words sparked a fire in the hearts of those who had lost everything. She made them believe in themselves again, in the possibility of a future. But the danger was far from over. The Zelithar Empire was relentless, and they would stop at nothing to crush any hope of rebellion. Elias knew they needed to act quickly, before the enemy could strike again. One evening, after a long day of strategizing, Elias found Serafina sitting alone in the command room. The lights were dim, and the only sound was the soft hum of the base's machinery. She was staring at a map of the world, her fingers lightly tracing the lines of human resistance movements. "Are you ready for what comes next?" Elias asked, stepping into the room. Serafina didn't look up. "I've never been more ready," she said, her voice calm. "But I can't do it alone, Elias." Elias stepped closer, his heart pounding. "You won't be, I'm with you." She finally looked up at him, her eyes meeting his with a fierceness that took his breath away. "I need you by my side, not just as a soldier, but as something more. I need you to believe in what we're fighting for." He didn't hesitate. "I do." And in that moment, everything changed. Elias had always fought out of necessity, but now he realized he was fighting for something far greater than survival. He was fighting for the future, for hope, and for Serafina. Serafina's expression softened, and she gave him a small, genuine smile. "We'll make it through this, Elias, together." The days that followed were filled with preparation. The resistance factions began to unite, their leaders arriving from all corners of the world. They came with their own histories, their own stories of survival, but now they shared a common goal: to defeat the Zelithar and take back their world. The base buzzed with activity as plans were drawn, weapons were forged, and alliances were made. Elias worked alongside Serafina, helping her coordinate the effort. They grew closer with each passing day. The connection between them deepened. What had begun as a simple act of saving a life had turned into something more, something neither of them had anticipated. One evening, as Elias and Serafina stood outside the base, looking out over the dark, desolate landscape, she spoke again. "We will rise from this," she said, her voice filled with conviction. "The Zelithar won't break us, we'll rebuild." Elias stood beside her, watching the stars in the sky. He had always believed that survival was the ultimate goal, but now he saw that there was something even more important: hope, a future. "Together," he said, his voice steady. "Yes," Serafina agreed, "together." As the days turned into weeks, Elias and Serafina forged an unbreakable bond. They became more than just allies, they became partners in the fight for humanity's future. Their shared purpose, their shared vision, united them in a way that no enemy could ever defeat. And for the first time in a long while, Elias believed. He believed that they could win. He believed that together they would rise above the flames and rebuild what had been lost. Together they would rise. The days turned into weeks, and the human resistance began to take shape. The various factions, once divided and scattered across the world, slowly gathered under one banner, Serafina's banner. Her vision had ignited something in people, a spark of hope that had been buried under years of war and oppression. Elias had never seen anything like it before. Her leadership wasn't about power or control. It was about inspiration. She made people believe again. Elias continued to work by her side, helping with strategy, making sure every plan was carefully thought out. The more they worked together, the stronger their bond became. At first, he had been unsure of his place in this rebellion, unsure of his own strength. He had always seen himself as a simple man, just a mechanic before the war, now just another soldier. But now, standing beside Serafina, he felt like he was part of something much bigger than himself. One day, as the resistance forces gathered, Serafina called for a council meeting in the base's command room. Elias was there, along with the leaders of the other factions. It was time to make a decision, whether to strike at the Zelithar now, while they were still scattered and weakened, or wait until they could build a larger force. The tension in the room was thick. Some of the leaders were eager to launch an immediate attack. They had lost too many already and wanted to strike back before the Zelithar could regroup. Others, however, wanted to be more cautious, arguing that they needed more time to prepare, to strengthen their numbers and their weapons. Elias watched Serafina carefully. She had been listening quietly, her eyes scanning the faces of the leaders. When the room fell silent, she stood, her presence commanding attention. "We fight now," she said, her voice calm but filled with an unwavering certainty. "The longer we wait, the stronger the Zelithar become. We can't afford to sit back and hope for a better opportunity. This is our chance, and we take it." Elias could see the fire in her eyes, the same fire that had sparked the hearts of everyone who followed her. She wasn't just a queen, she was a leader in every sense of the word. And in that moment he realized something important. He wasn't just following her because it was his duty. He was following her because he believed in her. The council room erupted into murmurs, but Elias felt a deep sense of pride well up inside him. He knew without a doubt that this was the right decision. They had to act or they would lose everything. As the meeting ended and the leaders left to prepare for the coming battle, Elias stayed behind for a moment, looking at Serafina. She had already turned her attention to the map of the enemy's forces, marking key locations and planning their next move. When she noticed him watching, she smiled softly. "We're going to win, Elias," she said, her voice low. "This is just the beginning." Elias nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. He had never felt more certain of anything in his life. The next few days were a whirlwind of preparations. The resistance moved quickly, gathering supplies, arming their soldiers, and preparing for the attack. Elias worked alongside the others, helping to make sure everything was in place. But even in the midst of all the chaos, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming, something that would change everything. The night before the attack, as Elias sat alone in his quarters, he thought back to the moment when he had carried Serafina through the flames. He had never imagined that one act of saving her would lead to all of this. Back then, he had been just trying to survive, but now he was fighting for a cause that meant something. He wasn't just protecting his people anymore. He was fighting for the future of humanity. He stood up, walking over to the window of his room. Outside, the stars shone brightly, distant and cold. He thought of Serafina and what she had said about rising, about rebuilding. It felt possible now more than ever, but the road ahead would be hard. The Zelithar were ruthless, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. His thoughts were interrupted by a soft knock at the door. He turned and saw Serafina standing in the doorway, her eyes tired but determined. "Elias," she said quietly, stepping inside. "Can we talk?" He nodded and gestured for her to sit. He knew she had been pushing herself too hard lately. They all had. But Serafina's resolve never wavered, and that was what kept everyone going. She sat down across from him, her gaze fixed on the ground for a moment before she met his eyes. "I know this is hard, for all of us, but we're ready, Elias, I can feel it. Tomorrow we take the fight to the Zelithar, and we're going to win." Elias didn't speak at first. He didn't need to, he knew what she was saying. The battle would be difficult, but they had no choice but to fight. They had no choice but to believe. "I'm with you," Elias said softly. "I always will be." Serafina smiled, a small, sincere smile that reached her eyes. "I'm glad to hear that." They sat in silence for a while, both lost in their thoughts, but despite the heaviness of the moment, Elias felt a sense of peace. Tomorrow they would begin their assault on the Zelithar forces. They had a plan. They had the will to win. And most importantly, they had each other. As the hours passed and the night deepened, Elias couldn't help but think about how far they had come. From the ruins of the city to this underground base, they had been through so much, but they had never given up. They had kept fighting, and now they were stronger than ever. The next morning they set out for battle. The resistance forces gathered in the underground tunnels, preparing to emerge and face the Zelithar. Elias, standing beside Serafina, could feel the tension in the air. This was it, the moment they had all been waiting for. The fight for humanity's future was about to begin. The assault was swift and brutal. They stormed the Zelithar's stronghold with everything they had: guns, explosives, and the raw determination of people who had nothing left to lose. Elias fought at the front, Serafina not far behind. Together they led the charge, pushing back the alien forces inch by inch. The battle raged on for hours, the sound of gunfire and explosions filling the air. Elias and Serafina fought side by side, their movements fluid and instinctual. They had become a team, a force to be reckoned with, and as the day wore on, it became clear that they were winning. The Zelithar were retreating. When the final shots were fired and the last of the Zelithar forces had been pushed back, Elias and Serafina stood in the midst of the battlefield, breathing heavily, their bodies covered in dirt and blood. They had done it. They had won. Elias looked at Serafina, her face covered in grime but her eyes burning with victory. She had led them to this moment, and now, with the Zelithar defeated, they could begin to rebuild. "We did it," Elias said, his voice hoarse but full of pride. Serafina nodded, her smile triumphant. "Yes, we did." In that moment, Elias realized that this was only the beginning. The war was not over, but they had taken the first step toward victory. Together, they had proven that no matter how dark the world became, there was always hope. And as long as they stood together, nothing could stop them. The victory over the Zelithar forces had been hard-earned, but it wasn't enough to bring the war to an end. It was only the beginning of a larger conflict that loomed on the horizon. Serafina and Elias knew the road ahead would be filled with more challenges, more battles, but they also knew that the tide was turning in humanity's favor. The resistance had gained momentum after the attack on the Zelithar stronghold. News of their victory spread quickly, not just among the human survivors, but also to the other alien races who had been silently observing the conflict. The Zelithar were powerful, but they weren't invincible. The humans had proven that, and now they had a chance to win the war. The days following the battle were filled with planning and strategy. Serafina led the charge, her mind working tirelessly to organize their forces and determine their next move. Elias worked alongside her, handling logistics, overseeing the training of new recruits, and ensuring that every weapon and supply was in place for the next phase of their mission. Though they had won a major battle, the war was far from over. The Zelithar Empire was vast, with countless worlds under its control. The fight to free humanity would be long and hard, but Serafina was resolute. She believed in their cause, in the strength of the resistance, and in the possibility of a future where humanity could rebuild its world. As the weeks passed, Elias began to notice something he hadn't before: how the war had changed him. Before Serafina had entered his life, he had been a quiet, reluctant fighter, a man who did what was necessary but never thought much about the bigger picture. Now, standing beside her, he felt the weight of the future pressing down on him. He was no longer just a soldier. He was a part of something greater, something worth fighting for. The resistance forces grew stronger every day. More survivors joined their ranks, drawn by the hope that Serafina had sparked in their hearts. People who had been hiding in fear, afraid to fight back, were now standing tall. They were ready to take back their world, and they were ready to do it together. One afternoon, after a long day of strategy sessions and training drills, Elias found himself in the command room with Serafina. She was poring over a map of the Zelithar Empire, marking the locations of key military installations and supply routes. Her face was tired, but her eyes still held the same fire that had led them this far. "We need to hit them where it hurts," Serafina said, her finger tracing a line on the map. "This will cripple their supply lines and give us the upper hand." Elias nodded. "It's a good plan. But we'll need to move quickly. The Zelithar are bound to retaliate once they realize what we've done. We can't afford to wait. If we give them time to regroup, it will be even harder to strike again. We do this now, or we risk losing everything." The urgency in her voice struck a chord with Elias. He knew she was right. The Zelithar had already shown that they wouldn't hesitate to crush any resistance. If they wanted a future, they had to keep moving forward, no matter how difficult the path. That night, Serafina gathered the leaders of the resistance factions for a meeting. The plan was set, and the operation would begin at dawn. They would strike a key Zelithar supply base deep within enemy territory, hoping to disrupt their war machine and give humanity a fighting chance. As the leaders discussed the details of the mission, Elias stayed by Serafina's side. She was calm, focused, but he could see the weight of the decision in her eyes. This wasn't just about winning a battle, it was about choosing to fight for the future of their people. The pressure was enormous. Before the meeting ended, Serafina turned to Elias. "You'll be with me on this one, won't you?" Elias didn't hesitate. "I'm with you always." She smiled, a rare, genuine smile that warmed his heart. "I couldn't do this without you." The next morning, the resistance forces moved out. They marched in silence, the weight of what they were about to do hanging over them. The air was thick with anticipation and the road ahead was uncertain, but they were united. They had a purpose, and that purpose was clear: to free humanity from the Zelithar's grip. The journey to the Zelithar base was long and treacherous. They moved through dense forests and across barren landscapes, always on the lookout for enemy patrols. Every step brought them closer to their goal, but it also brought them closer to danger. The Zelithar were never far behind, and they would stop at nothing to destroy the human resistance. As they neared the base, Elias felt a familiar tension in his chest. This was it. This was the moment they had been preparing for. The plan was simple: sneak into the enemy stronghold, disable their defenses, and destroy their supply caches. But simple didn't always mean easy. Elias and Serafina led the charge, moving quietly through the shadows, their footsteps muffled by the thick underbrush. The others followed, keeping their distance and staying hidden until the time was right. The Zelithar base loomed ahead, a dark, intimidating fortress surrounded by high walls and watchtowers. It was heavily guarded, but they had no choice. This was their best shot. As they approached the base's perimeter, Elias gave Serafina a brief look. She nodded, signaling for the team to split up. They had to get inside, and they had to do it fast. Elias and a small team of soldiers moved toward the outer wall, using explosives to breach the perimeter. The blast was loud, but it was quick. They slipped through the opening and made their way toward the heart of the base. The enemy was already on high alert, but the humans were faster. They moved like shadows, silently taking out guards and disabling security systems as they went. Serafina was at the front, her eyes sharp and focused. She led them through the maze of corridors, her confidence unwavering. Elias stayed close behind, watching her every move. She had become more than just a queen to him. She was a leader, a force of nature, and he couldn't help but admire her. They reached the central control room, where the Zelithar were coordinating their operations. The door was locked, but it didn't take long for Elias and his team to break through. Inside, they found the Zelithar officers, stunned and unprepared for the attack. The fight that followed was quick and brutal. Elias moved with precision, taking down the enemies around him. Serafina, though injured, fought just as fiercely. Together, they were unstoppable. When the last of the Zelithar forces were neutralized, Elias and Serafina stood in the control room, catching their breath. The base was theirs. The plan had worked. Serafina turned to Elias, her face smeared with dirt and blood, but her eyes alive with victory. "We did it." Elias smiled, his heart swelling with pride. "We did." But even as they stood victorious, Elias knew this was only one battle in a much larger war. The Zelithar Empire was vast, and they wouldn't give up so easily. But today they had taken a major step toward reclaiming their world. As the resistance forces celebrated their victory, Serafina pulled Elias aside. "This is just the beginning, Elias. There's still so much more to do, but we've proven that we can win." Elias nodded. "And we will keep fighting together." She smiled again, her expression softer now, as if the weight of the world had been lifted, even just for a moment. "Together!" And with that, they knew their fight wasn't over. But for the first time, it felt like they had a real chance at winning. Together, they would continue to fight. Together, they would rise. The victory at the Zelithar base had been a turning point, but Serafina and Elias knew that it was only the beginning. The human resistance had struck a major blow to the enemy, but the Zelithar were far from defeated. They still controlled vast swathes of territory, and their armies were relentless. In the days following the attack, the base where the resistance had regrouped hummed with activity. Soldiers trained, engineers worked to repair equipment, and strategists pored over maps and intelligence reports. It was a busy, tense atmosphere. Everyone was preparing for what would come next. Serafina spent most of her time with the leaders of the different factions, coordinating plans and making decisions that would shape the course of the war. She was tireless, driven by a deep belief in the cause and a need to protect those who followed her. Elias, always at her side, worked alongside her to help turn her ideas into action. He was no longer just the soldier who had carried the queen to safety. He had become a trusted advisor, someone Serafina relied on to help her lead. Though the weight of leadership pressed heavily on Serafina's shoulders, she never once wavered. She had grown into her role in ways Elias never thought possible. The woman who had once been just a symbol of hope had become the very embodiment of it. Her presence inspired those around her, and they followed her with a loyalty that was unshakable. But despite the progress, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. The Zelithar were not going to take their losses lightly. They would retaliate, and it would come quickly. The question was when and where. One evening, as dusk settled over the base, Elias found Serafina standing outside, looking out at the horizon. The sky was a deep shade of purple, and the air was cool. She looked tired, her face drawn, but her eyes still held that familiar spark of determination. Elias approached quietly, standing beside her. He didn't speak right away, just taking in the sight of her. He had come to admire her strength, but he also knew the burden she carried. She was their queen, their hope, but she was still human, and the weight of it all could break even the strongest person. "You're thinking about the next move," he said, breaking the silence. Serafina nodded slowly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. We've won a few battles, but the Zelithar won't stop. They'll come for us again, and when they do, we need to be ready." Elias glanced at her. "We're ready." Serafina turned to him, her expression softening. "I know. But are we truly ready for what's coming? We may have won this battle, but the war is far from over. And it won't be easy. We've lost so much already, Elias. I can't afford to lose any more." Elias met her gaze, his voice steady. "We won't lose, not as long as we fight together." A faint smile touched Serafina's lips. "I believe that, but sometimes I wonder how much more we can ask of our people." Before Elias could respond, a figure appeared in the distance, walking toward them. It was one of the scouts, a young man covered in dirt and dust from a recent reconnaissance mission. "Serafina," the scout called out as he approached. "We have news." The three of them walked quickly to the command room where the rest of the leadership team was waiting. The scout handed over a datapad, which Serafina took without a word. She read the report quickly, her brow furrowing as she processed the information. "The Zelithar are massing forces," she said after a moment, her voice cold. "They've reinforced their main fleet and are heading toward Earth's orbit. They're planning something big. We don't know what yet, but we have to assume it's a full-scale assault." Elias felt the weight of those words settle over him. The Zelithar were coming. And this time it wouldn't be a skirmish. It would be their final attempt to wipe out the resistance once and for all. "We need to strike first," one of the faction leaders suggested, his voice firm. "If we can hit them hard before they get organized, we might stand a chance." Serafina nodded slowly, her eyes never leaving the report. "We don't have the luxury of waiting, but we can't go in blind. We need to gather more intelligence, hit their weakest points, and disrupt their communication. If we can break their coordination, we'll have an edge." The room fell into a tense silence as the leaders considered her words. Finally, they agreed on a plan. It would be dangerous, risky, but it was their only option. The next few days were filled with frantic preparation. The resistance gathered every available fighter, every weapon, and every resource they could find. It was all hands on deck. They worked around the clock to ensure that everything was ready. Elias did everything he could to help, organizing squads, overseeing repairs, and working with the engineers to ensure the weapons were in working order. But his mind was always on Serafina. He could see the toll that the constant pressure was taking on her. The long hours, the constant weight of leadership, it was wearing her down. Late one night, as Elias worked alone in the command room, Serafina appeared in the doorway. She had clearly been working all day, and her exhaustion was evident. But when she saw him, she offered a small smile. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" she asked quietly. Elias nodded, standing up to face her. He could see the weariness in her eyes, but he also saw something else, a determination that never seemed to fade, no matter how much she had been through. I've been thinking, she began, her voice softer than usual. We've come so far, Elias. We've won battles, we've united the resistance, but the war isn't over. And I can't help but wonder what comes after. What happens if we win? Elias took a deep breath. We rebuild, he said, his voice steady. We rebuild this world together. Serafina looked at him, her eyes searching his face. Do you ever wonder if we're doing the right thing, if the cost is worth it? The question hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Elias thought for a moment, his heart aching with the weight of it all. They had lost so much already, so many lives, so many dreams shattered by the Zelithar. But in his heart he knew the answer. We don't have a choice, he said quietly. We fight because we have to, because this is the only way to make sure our people have a future. Because we can't give up, not now. Serafina's gaze softened and she nodded slowly. I know, sometimes I wonder what kind of world we'll be left with when this is all over, what kind of life we'll have. Elias stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder. We'll build it, Serafina, we'll build it together. For a moment the two of them stood there, silently. The weight of the war, the uncertainty of the future, all of it seemed to hang between them. But in that silence, Elias felt something more. It wasn't just the weight of the war. It was a bond, one that had grown stronger with every challenge they faced. The next morning, the plan was put into action. The resistance launched their strike against the Zelithar, hitting their supply lines, disrupting their communications, and crippling their ability to respond. It was a brutal, hard-fought battle, but the humans were determined. They fought not just for survival, but for a future that they had only begun to imagine. As the battle raged, Elias and Serafina fought side by side once again. It was a struggle, but they never faltered. They had come too far, and they couldn't stop now. When the dust finally settled, they stood victorious. The Zelithar had been pushed back. The resistance had won another battle. But this victory was different. It wasn't just a small triumph, it was a turning point. The humans had proven once again that they would not be broken. They would not be defeated. Serafina turned to Elias, her face streaked with dirt and blood, but her eyes shining with something more. We did it, she said softly. Elias nodded, his heart full of pride. Together. And as they stood there, surrounded by the remnants of battle, they knew this was just the beginning. The war wasn't over, but the fight had shifted. The Zelithar had underestimated humanity's resolve. And now it was time to show them what it meant to face an enemy that would never surrender. Together, they would rise. Together, they would win.